Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We're doing another Iran war video. If you haven't seen my last two Iran war videos, that's fine as long as you're more or less caught up to the situation in Iran at the beginning of April. That's when my last video kind of ended its coverage, and during this video I'll be discussing everything that has happened in the past month or so, and I will also be making some very concrete predictions about the future and where I think the war is heading and where I think the global economy is heading. Spoiler alert, the outlook is not good. If you haven't, please like, comment, or subscribe. It helps with the engagement. And without further ado, let's jump right into it. Alright, so first we'll do a little quick recap for those of you whose maybe your memory is a little hazy or you didn't watch my last video. We'll talk about, what set off this war and how it's been going in the first active shooting phase of the war. Then we'll talk about some of the predictions I made at the end of my last video and why, thankfully, I was wrong. I'm actually happy that I was wrong in this case because my predictions were pretty bleak. We'll talk about the current situation that's happened this past month, what I call the Stitzkrieg, or the phony war phase of this Iranian conflict. We'll talk about Operation Freedom and the U.S. attempt to reopen shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz. We'll talk about the peace deals, quote-unquote, that have been proposed and the diplomatic negotiations that happened in Pakistan. We'll talk about some of the wider diplomatic consequences of this war. Specifically, we're looking at realignments within the Middle East. We'll talk about the global and the American economy and why it's all pretty much screwed. We'll talk about one of the consequences of this, which is the decrease in global fertilizer production that will potentially cause mass starvation. And then we'll talk about why the entire global system is collapsing right before our very eyes, and it's going to cause the end of this global and financial world order as we've come to know it since the end of the Cold War. How fun! Alright, last time on the Epstein Wars. So we'll start with basically the justifications for this war. First of all, you gotta understand that Trump is already bored of this war. He wanted this war to be over like 2 months ago, okay? He thought, just like Venezuela, he could get in, kill or capture the Ayatollah, get out, and the Iranian government would basically just surrender and concede to all of his demands. Obviously, this did not happen. The other important cause of this war is, of course, Israel. I've talked at length about how Israel wants to establish a greater Israel. In order to do that, they need to destabilize the Middle East as much as possible, and specifically, Iran is a very strong regional power, and they basically want Iran to become a failed state, to completely collapse, and to no longer be able to oppose their geopolitical ambitions in the region. The stated justification for all of this, of course, is the, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon line. This is obviously bullshit. You literally just go back and look at, they were saying the same shit in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2002, 2003. And of course, Trump claimed that he destroyed Iran's entire nuclear program, back last July. So obviously you just shouldn't trust anything that they're saying about this matter, because it is almost guaranteed to be complete and utter nonsense. During this first phase of the war, the Ayatollah, the leader of Iran, was killed, and now it's come out that his son is severely injured in a U.S. airstrike. He has severe burns over large parts of his body. It's also come out recently that the initial waves of attacks against U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait in particular were actually much more extensive than previously thought. In particular, it looks like the Iranian IRGC has gone after communication and radar systems. This is probably a smart move on their part, because you destroy the communication infrastructure, it means the bases can't coordinate with each other, they can't, share information. And the radar systems are important because these are the systems that detect incoming missiles and drones, and without these systems it becomes much harder to actually knock these drones and missiles out of the sky. The U.S. has actually abandoned a couple of its bases because it was determined that with the loss of these radar and communication systems, it was simply no longer safe for any U.S. personnel to be located there. This is a huge deal that is not being talked about enough, and it is a clear sign of American weakness in the region. At the same time, Lebanon has been invaded, and the invasion of Lebanon is still ongoing, although there haven't been that many frontline on-the-ground changes since my last video, so I won't really cover it. But rest assured, they're still being bombed every day. The Israeli army is still, depopulating entire areas and trying to seize the territory for themselves, essentially. And of course, the other thing that hasn't changed is that the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, and this has had disastrous consequences around the globe. And the consequences of this closure are only getting much more severe. All right, now let's look at what I got wrong for my last video. So one of the big things that I said at the end of my last video was that Karg Island, the main Iranian oil export sort of center, would be militarily invaded by the United States. Thankfully, that did not happen. I think the generals at the top realized that an amphibious invasion of that scale deep inside hostile territory was pretty much impossible. So thankfully, that didn't happen. And the price of oil hasn't reached, I said it would reach like $200 a barrel. That has not happened, parentheses, yet. The main reason this hasn't happened, right now, right at the time of recording this video, it's at about $109 per barrel, and it's been spiking up the past couple of days since Trump basically got nothing out of his trip to China. The price of oil has varied super crazily, as you can see on this graph here. We've seen fluctuations of like $20 a barrel, which is ridiculously high. And by the way, that 109 number is up from about $65 before this war started, so it has almost doubled, and it will very soon probably actually have doubled. The reason the price hasn't gone super crazy is because every country around the entire world has been basically discharging oil from their strategic reserves. Okay, so this has eased the supply shock in the market. The problem is now we are running out of our strategic reserves, and not just us. Pretty much every country on Earth is running out of their reserves. There is one exception to that, and that is China. China still has enough reserves probably to see them through to the end of the year, but no other country prepared for this quite like China did. The main thing I want to say, though, is that we still have not crossed the point of no return. So even though the so let's say that the Strait of Hormuz opened tomorrow, the consequences that we've seen, about 500 billion barrels of oil that were supposed to come to the market that simply haven't and never will because of the shutdown of production facilities. That's not something that should get solved overnight, and the economic consequences will be disastrous but not apocalyptic. But the window of time is closing. If this lasts for another month or even 2 months, and easily I could see this status quo lasting until the end of the year, if that happens, the price of a barrel of oil again could very easily reach $200 a barrel, and we'll talk more later in the video about why that is such a big deal and the downstream effects that will have on the entire global economy. So I think it's safe to say that we have entered a new phase of the Iran war. The first phase was characterized by, constant targeting of infrastructure and oil production facilities and military sites by airstrikes or by missiles or by drones. But ever since sort of the beginning of April, basically all of that has stopped, and now we're in kind of a stalemate situation. Okay, there are exceptions to that, but for the most part, there haven't been many exchanges of fire between Iran and the U.S. In over a month. One of the big operations that took place shortly after I published my last video was Iran actually managed to down a U.S. fighter plane, and there was an operation to rescue both of the pilots. One of the pilots was very easily extracted. The other one turned into like a 36-hour hunt, manhunt for him, basically, and with the U.S. scrambling to get there before Iran did. There's a lot of fishy things that went down in this, supposed rescue. Some people are even saying that this rescue didn't happen at all. That was all a big show. I don't really know what to think, but that's what happened. It should also be noted that the interceptor shortage problem that I mentioned in my last video has not been solved. So a big reason that the U.S. had to kind of wind down operations and never followed through on Trump's threats, where, if you remember, he said that he was going to wipe out an entire civilization and he was going to bomb every single oil infrastructure plant that existed in all of Iran, and in return, Iran was probably going to bomb every single desalination plant in the Middle East, and that would have caused the entire Middle East to become uninhabitable. Luckily, none of that happened. And I think the reason that chain of escalation didn't go any farther is because in that situation, we would have been basically helpless to defend against more Iranian strikes. Iran still has plenty of missiles. It's estimated that they've only used about 50 or maybe 45% of their total stockpile, and they're, only about 30 or 35% of their total drone stockpile. Meanwhile, we've used about 3/4 of all of our interceptors. So as you can see, the imbalance there is pretty severe. Another development that happened in this past month is the U.S. has imposed a counter blockade over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, from a geopolitical framework, this makes sense, okay? Because this entire time during the hot phase of the war, Iranian oil tankers and Chinese oil tankers were still sneaking through, were still slipping through, as long as they followed the approved route, by the route that was approved by the Iranian government, and they could still deliver oil to markets in, for example, China. And this was a big deal because it meant the Iranian government could still collect the oil revenue from those oil sales, and it would be at a higher price because the global oil supply was squeezed, essentially. Now, because of the U.S. blockade, this is no longer possible. Iran can no longer sell its oil. The U.S. has intercepted, I believe it is 78 ships attempting to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and has intercepted with force, like physically boarded them or damaged 4 ships. Okay, those are the figures on that. Now, again, geopolitically, this makes sense. I don't really know. The U.S. has always been a very strong naval power. It's one of our defining features as a global superpower. So it makes sense that we would employ our Navy in this way. The problem is now the total global supply of oil has been further decreased, and thus the price impact on everyday people is going to be even harsher, going to be even higher. While this may be a good move strategically, economically, this is going to cause even more damage down the road. Another hilarious thing that happened that I found quite amusing is that, just like George Bush famously did, Trump has declared mission accomplished. Operation Epic Fury is over. We won. Hooray. We did it. Of course, none of our military strategic goals were accomplished. Iran hasn't given up their nuclear weapons. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed, but never mind all that. We did it. Hooray. Break out the piñatas, etc. The real reason, probably, that they declared this operation over is because the War Powers Resolution, the act which allows the president to act unilaterally in military conflicts, is only good for 60 days. So after those 60 days, the president then has to provide some sort of justification for Congress as to why the conflict or the war should continue, and Congress has to approve it through a vote. And it's very likely that such an approval would not be able to pass through Congress because, again, everybody kind of hates this war, and even a lot of Republicans secretly do not like this war. Of course, we're still doing the blockade, which is still undeniably a military action, but whatever further military actions the United States takes in the future, they'll just call it something else, slap a new coat of paint on it so that they don't have to justify it to Congress, and they can keep the whole thing rolling. So it's, in reality, declaring Operation Epstein's Fury over is a pretty much meaningless gesture. One of the more interesting events that occurred during this past month was Project Freedom! So this was something that had been kind of bubbling in the back of my mind for a while now. Why doesn't the U.S. just take some of its Navy ships, get like a destroyer task force going, and physically escort tankers through the straits, so that they can, get oil and then they can exit, and they'll have the protection of the U.S. Navy. So hopefully they won't be hit by any, drones or missiles. And the U.S. Navy actually tried to do this, and it worked for about 36 hours, and then they stopped. Now, why did it stop? Well, the stated reason is because Saudi Arabia wouldn't bite. They wouldn't allow the U.S. to use their airspace and to use their ports for this operation. Now, that is probably true. That probably happened. But something tells me that's not the actual reason that this didn't work. I think there are two main factors here. One is security. I don't think that the amounts of firepower necessary to protect a convoy of oil tankers was physically able to be gathered in the Strait of Hormuz, right? The U.S. is a global empire. We have naval task forces everywhere. A absurd concentration of firepower would have been required in order to actually protect this shipping lane. It's also worth noting that unlike in the 1980s, when the U.S. did a similar operation escorting oil tankers, first of all, we actually have fewer ships than we did in the 1980s. The Navy has pursued a strategy of more firepower on fewer ships, so whereas before we had about 600, 700 active duty, we had over 800 active duty naval vessels. Now that number is down to about 600. Okay, so we actually don't have nearly as many smaller, like destroyers or light craft perfect for running these escort tasks and intercepting incoming fire than we used to. Also, it's worth noting that unlike the 1980s, the U.S. Navy was not actively being targeted in the 1980s, whereas now obviously our ships are. The other issue is one of cost. Even if we were able to gather the naval firepower, the naval vessels necessary to run these convoys, 24/7, it would be insanely expensive, both in terms of fuel, in terms of manpower, and in terms of all the interceptors and ammunition that we would need to knock all of the incoming Iranian fire out of the sky. So basically, I think that the U.S. Navy realized that this operation was infeasible, and after 36 hours, they decided to call the whole thing off, and they just used the Saudi Arabia thing as an excuse to sort of save face. It's also possible that a U.S. naval vessel was actually hit and was severely damaged, and that was also part of their calculation, but of course we don't know that information, and we probably won't for a while now. As the Megadeth song goes, peace sells, but who is buying? So there was a ceasefire announced on April 8th. And when I say announced, I mean announced. Trump literally just went to Truth Social, said, hey, we have a ceasefire now, it's all cool, it's all gravy. The Iranian government came out and they're like, no, we don't. We never signed any agreement. We never even discussed terms. But they both kind of just decided to hold to the ceasefire anyway and see where things went. They held negotiations in Islamabad in Pakistan from April 11th through the 12th, and the usual gaggle of incompetent Trump administration MAGA officials showed up. You had J.D. Vance, you had Steve Witkoff, I think even Jared Kushner was there, and of course they accomplished exactly nothing. Now, Trump has pulled this trick many, many times now. He says that he's meeting up with Iran to negotiate peace, and a peace deal will be signed soon by the end of the week. And then the oil market tanks, and then him and all his buddies buy up oil futures. And then when he announces that all of it was bullshit, the price spikes back up again. Rinse and repeat. This has happened, I don't even know, 7, 8 times now, this exact cycle that I'm describing. So really the whole thing is just a way for Trump and all of his cronies to make a bunch of money. And any sort of peace negotiations or ceasefire talks or anything of that nature is probably bullshit. And there is a very easy way to tell if it's bullshit or not. All you need to do to figure out if any ceasefire is for real is to go to this website, liveuamap.com, click on the Israel-Palestine tab, press refresh, and if there is a bunch of death markers and airstrikes and stuff over Lebanon from the past 24 hours, the ceasefire is not happening. Iran has been very clear that any ceasefire is contingent on Israel halting its operations in Lebanon, and Israel has no intention of doing so. So I think Iran has no intention of signing any real peace agreement. Okay, so anytime Trump runs his mouth and shoots off on Twitter, there's a very easy, simple test you can do at home to figure out if something might potentially come out of this. And every time I've run this test, it has not let me down. Okay, let's look at the proposals that both sides proposed during the talks in Pakistan to see what they have in common and where the points of contention between the two sides are. We'll start with the American side here on the left. So first of all, Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz immediately. They must have guaranteed maritime security, so ships passing through the strait must be ensured safe passage, safe navigation. There must be nuclear constraints placed on Iran, so Iran must stop pursuing nuclear weapons. There is conditional sanctions relief, the release of frozen Iranian assets, and this ceasefire that Trump has negotiated can be extended while peace negotiations are ongoing. If you remember, originally the ceasefire was for 2 weeks, but Trump has kept extending it and kept extending it and kept extending it because he doesn't want to start firing again. And even though peace negotiations have gone nowhere because he's an idiot and a pussy and has no other choice, basically. Okay, on the Iran side, what they want is a cessation of all war in Iraq, Lebanon, Iran, and Yemen. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that the Israeli invasion of Lebanon is part of the Iranian peace proposal, part of their ceasefire demands, basically. The immediate cessation of war in Iran in perpetuity. So that means the U.S. can't do what it did last time and negotiate a ceasefire and then 8 months later just start bombing them again. They want the war to be over from now until basically the end of time. Obviously, Iran would also reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and they would, this is important here, establish a protocol and conditions to ensure freedom and security of navigation in the strait. What this actually means is that Iran would basically control who comes in and out of the strait and would be able to charge a fee or a tax on any ship passing through the strait. This is something they were doing before the U.S. started blockading the strait. They were actually demanding ships pay a toll, basically, to even pass through the strait. And Iran now said that they want their current control of the strait to be permanent, essentially. They would also like war reparations, which means that the U.S. would give them some amount of money as sort of compensation for, blowing a bunch of shit up. Sanctions would be lifted. Iranian assets would be unfrozen. And Iran would promise not to seek nuclear weapons, but makes no promises in giving up technology or giving up actual uranium. So what are the differences between the two? There are a lot of similarities. They both want the strait open. They both agree that assets would be unfrozen. They both agree that there would be sanctions relief. The difference is, one, Iran wants to control the strait, whereas the U.S. wanted the status quo from before the war, which was free navigation for all countries. Iran wants no more war in Yemen and Lebanon, whereas the U.S. is indifferent, or, because of Israel actively wants those wars in Lebanon. And the other thing is the payment of war reparations. Trump has said that he will not pay war reparations. That is a hard line for him. He does not want to pay war reparations because that would be that is a clear sign of defeat. You don't pay war reparations unless you lose a war. Okay, never. So if we did pay war reparations to Iran, it would be us essentially admitting defeat. So as a consequence of this war, there has been a bit of a geopolitical realignment within the Middle East. In my first video on the Iran war, I broke down every faction in the Middle East and what they want and their relations with every other faction. Go back and watch that video if you want. But basically, there have been some changes in that front. There's essentially two directions this is flowing in. Countries such as Saudi Arabia are distancing themselves further from the U.S. as a consequence of this war, because they're really pissed about the fact that they can't export oil and the fact that we have not been able to militarily defend them, that their capital has been getting hit by drones and their production facilities have been getting hit by drones, and we essentially broke our promise to be their military protector. And so Saudi Arabia has been drifting apart from us. The opposite side of this coin, though, is the UAE. The United Arab Emirates has been getting closer to the US, closer to Israel, and has been, shall we say, more willing to participate in U.S. military operations in the region. They actually helped us out significantly during the aforementioned Operation Freedom, and were punished as a result with a new wave of drone and missile attacks. So what this has actually led to is sort of a Cold War within the Middle East. So on one side, you have what I'll call the anti-Israel axis of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, all countries which want to carve out their own spheres of influence in the Middle East and don't like the growing threat that Israel represents. This is particularly thorny in the case of Turkey because Turkey is a U.S. ally and it's part of NATO. So if there is a conflict between Israel and Turkey, it's sort of unclear which side America would support. And by the articles of the NATO convention, we would actually be obligated to support Turkey, assuming Israel was the one that attacked. So that's a whole other messy situation that we don't have time to get into right now. But in the near future, like next year or maybe at the end of this year, we might come back and revisit this topic. Okay, so that's the anti-Israel axis, but then there's the sort of pro-Israel axis, which is Ethiopia, Israel, and the UAE. This is more of a alliance of convenience rather than some kind of overarching ideological alliance. For example, Ethiopia and Egypt have been in a state of kind of Cold War for a while now because Ethiopia is trying to build this big-ass dam on the Nile River, which, if you know anything about Egypt, they rely super heavily on the Nile River, so any decrease in water in the Nile River is going to dramatically impact Egypt. They are also both supporting opposite sides in the ongoing Sudanese civil war. Sudan's been in a state of civil war for about 2 years now, and each side is kind of picking a different side. The same goes in Yemen. The UAE and Saudi Arabia, even though it's not shown on this map, are also have their own sort of fronts or groups within Yemen that they're supporting at odds with each other. Part of this ongoing rift is that the United Arab Emirates has officially left OPEC. OPEC is the the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So the UAE leaving OPEC means that they are unchaining themselves from the cartel, and they are essentially removing all quotas or all limits on their production. So OPEC was a global cartel that limited on purpose the daily production of oil in order to keep the price at a level that would be profitable for all of them. Because otherwise one country like Saudi Arabia could just pump out a shit ton of oil, undercut everyone else, and basically drive every other oil producing country out of business. And they all realized it was smarter to work together to prevent this from happening than all get into a price war with each other. But the UAE left OPEC, so that they're basically no longer playing by those rules. Another diplomatic movement, you could say, that we've been witnessing is Europe has been getting more and more fed up with America's shit. Spain said that they would not allow U.S. planes to land in Spain en route to the Middle East, and we have withdrawn thousands of troops from Europe, including most notably in Germany. And this is double ironic because the largest U.S. medical facilities in Europe were in Germany. That was one of the main functions of our base there. And so now those medical facilities are gone. So, if troops coming back from the Middle East are injured, they're shut out of luck, I guess. I don't really know what the plan there is. Europe's been pissed at the U.S. for a while now, especially since that whole Greenland fiasco that happened, and God, that was only like 4 months ago. That was only in January. Jesus Christ. And I think this is a direction they will continue heading for the rest of at least Trump's time in office. I don't see our relationship with Europe getting any better in the near future. Yeah. The last piece of diplomatic news that happened, and the reason I actually delayed making this video, was Trump made a state visit to China, and China basically humiliated him. She refused to go out to the plane and meet him, and directly called the U.S. a waning or a failing power to Trump's face, but Trump was either too stupid to realize it, or wanted to save his own ass and went on TV and blamed Joe Biden, as he always does. These talks accomplished nothing in terms of resolving the Iran war, and basically it was just a way for Trump and all of his billionaire pedophile friends like Elon Musk to go over there and pitch their various business schemes and whatever to try and get in bed with the Chinese government. Trump also announced that China would be making a $1 trillion investment into the United States. Now, if you've been around for a while, if you watch my channel for a while, you'll know that anytime Trump announces a business investment into the United States, it's almost certainly a lie. But even if this sounds good on paper, and you might think it does sound good on paper, China doesn't really operate in the same way the U.S. does in terms of its foreign business opportunities. China, because their economy is much more centrally planned, is much more influenced by the government instead of private corporations, there is always strings attached when it comes to Chinese economic investment. They have this strategy where they offer a loan to a country, and they're essentially giving that money back to themselves, because they will offer the loan and then it will be a Chinese company that builds the railway or the road or the port or whatever. And then when the country defaults on that loan, they basically just take over that infrastructure for themselves and own it outright. So that's how they've been able to acquire, for example, the largest port in Sri Lanka through this sort of debt trap Belt and Road Initiative system. So if China were to do that to the United States, there would be consequences to that action. It wouldn't just be a strict net benefit for us. All right, now we get to the real fun stuff. So I've been thinking about this a lot. We have lived in a world, or at least certainly I have lived in a world, where it was always just assumed that if you wanted to buy something, it would be available, right? If I wanted to go buy a car, I could just go somewhere and buy a car. If I wanted to buy some lettuce, I could just go down to the store and buy some lettuce, right? There was never any real risk of not being able to physically acquire some sort of item. But this sort of fantasy land we've been living in is about to come to an end. We do not, in fact, live in the Star Trek utopia future, a post-scarcity world where I can press a button on the side of my spaceship and have any good perfectly replicated, okay? That's not real. It doesn't happen. So 20% of all global supply is offline and has been offline for months now. Again, even if the Strait were open tomorrow, a significant portion of this, about half, has been bombed to smithereens, and another quarter or so has been shut off, and turning those stations, turning those facilities back on is not a simple matter. It will take several months to do that, okay? So again, even if tomorrow, boom, magically, Strait is open again, it would take at least until the end of the year for oil production to hit the level it was at before the war started, okay? And that's best case scenario. Of course, I don't think the Strait will open tomorrow. I don't think it will open the week after that. I think, again, we're probably looking maybe at the end of this year, but probably sometime next year until the Strait is actually open. In the meantime, global oil reserves are at the lowest levels they've been literally ever. Every single country is both shorting the Brent crude prices, shorting oil futures in an attempt to keep the price low, even though it's, essentially like lighting money on fire. And they are releasing all of the reserves in their strategic oil reserve. We've already seen some real consequences of this. For example, Europe will run out of jet fuel by the end of June. California has about 6 weeks left until they are out of fuel. We are already starting to see a situation where in the very near future there will be some actual physical shortages. So where does all this lead to? Starting probably, if I had to guess, at the beginning of July, we are going to see the implementation of rationing, okay? So it is simply impossible for the level of current oil demand to continue. The supply of oil has shrunk by 20%, and demand has to meet that decrease. Okay, there's no way to magically create more oil to satisfy demand. The only solution is to drive down demand. Of course, higher prices are part of that, but the other thing that is inevitable pretty much at this point is oil rationing. Okay, so that means only people with, odd numbered license plates or whatever are allowed to fill up with oil or fill up with gas on these specific days. Count on that happening in the future. Now, one thing that's really been bothering me this entire time is the freaking stock market, okay? Now, since Pam Bondi, said, the Dow Jones is at 50,000. That's why it doesn't matter that we ignore the Epstein victims and censor all the Epstein files. I'm Pam Bondi. I got fired. That was a terrible impression. Anyway, since she said that, the stock market did take a significant dip, but it actually has pretty much recovered to that level of the Dow Jones being at 50,000. So it hasn't changed really at all since the war kicked off. It's just seen, massive up and down swings, which again is all driven by insider trading and stuff like that. But the question is, why hasn't there been a giant, insane plunge, the likes of which happened during COVID or 2008 or whatever? And I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, do those finance bros, do the people working in Wall Street not understand that we are living in a world where the entire system that has sustained global economic growth is about to come apart at the seams? And the answer is no. They actually don't understand this. When you live your life in the financial sector, you just see money as a bunch of numbers. You forget that the economy is like an actual physical thing with physical goods. And it's not just a bunch of financialization bullshit, right? So the market essentially doesn't know how to price in the fact that the production of oil has dropped off a cliff. Because traditionally, another question I see get asked a lot is, sure, the global supply of oil has contracted by 20%, and sure, prices are on the rise, but isn't that actually a good thing? Because that means that American oil companies can, produce more oil at a more competitive rate? And the answer is kind of. Okay, so first of all, I don't know where this, American mental disease comes from, where they think that if ExxonMobil is suddenly making record-breaking profits, which by the way they are right now, somehow that benefits you, the average person. Unless you own stock or unless you work for that company, they're able to charge you with higher gas prices, and you are getting screwed. Okay, unequivocally, you are getting screwed. Yeah, trickle-down economics is bullshit. All right, don't fall for it. The other issue is that it takes time to drill for oil. Now, because of the shale revolution and because of fracking, that time has indeed, over the past couple decades, been dramatically reduced. Now they can get an oil well operational in about 6 or 7 weeks, which is far, far faster than the year or two that it used to take. The real problem, though, is a matter of logistics distribution. So even if you bring new sources of oil online, you do not have the pipelines, you do not have the ports, you do not have the shipping routes to transport that oil to where it needs to go. For example, did you know there is no oil pipeline connecting the oil-producing regions of Texas to the Pacific coast? There is no way for oil to get from the Permian Basin over the Rocky Mountains and into California where it can be refined. There isn't a pipeline. The only way to do it is to load it up on a ship and sail all the way around the tip of South America or go through the Panama Canal, which of course is horrendously expensive. So even if we increase domestic production here, it does not mean that we will magically be paying lower gas prices, okay? I mean, it will help, don't get me wrong, but you also must consider that every single other country on Earth also wants to buy any oil that we produce. So even though we are producing more oil, we are then going to sell it to, for example, Germany, because maybe Germany is willing to pay $6.50 per gallon for that, barrel of oil or tank of gas or whatever. And maybe in the U.S. it would have only sold for $5. So a global oil shortage will impact domestic prices, even if domestic oil production increases. That's the point. Another worrying impact of all of this is the effect on fertilizer. Fertilizer leads to food production. A decrease in the production of fertilizer leads to a decrease in the production of food, leads to 100 million people starving to death by this time next year. So first of all, there are three types of fertilizer. The first type is potash. That is potassium-based, and it is primarily sourced from Canada, Belarus, and Russia. If you recall, back in 2022, one of the big concerns with the whole Russia-Ukraine war was that the export of Russian fertilizer would be impacted, and that would cause, global famine, basically. Luckily, that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. The Ukraine grain deal, Canada ramped up production, etc. But there still is a global potash shortage that hasn't really been resolved because of that Russia-Ukraine conflict. Then we have phosphate, which is basically just fossilized bird poop that is sourced a little bit from Saudi Arabia, from Morocco, and from Florida. Out of the three, this is the one that has been the least affected. Finally, we get to nitrogen, which is derived from oil or natural gas compounds, and one of the biggest producers of nitrogen-based fertilizer was Qatar. If you remember, back during my last video, I mentioned that the largest natural gas export terminal in the world was attacked in Qatar, and one of the other chief exports or products of that plant was ammonia that was used to make fertilizer. In fact, since the start of this war, 30 to 35% of global ammonia production has been taken offline. This means that the production of nitrogen-based fertilizer has fallen off a cliff, and we've already started seeing shortages. This primarily affects China, Southeast Asia, Brazil, and India, but the effects, again, it's a global supply shortage. The effects will be felt globally. What this means is during the planting season this spring, farmers were not able to use the amount of fertilizer that they ordinarily would have, and because of this, come harvest time in the fall, there will be significantly lower crop yields than there have been previous years. This will likely cause food shortages in many different countries. This is also impacting American farmers. American farmers have seen the price of fertilizer skyrocket, and we've seen record numbers of farm bankruptcies in the past year between the Iran war and all of the tariffs and whatnot. So, in conclusion, we are doomed.
Our universe is doomed! Doomed!
Alright, all jokes aside, I want to kind of give you a step-by-step breakdown of where I think this is all heading, and how basically the Iran war is the final nail in the coffin that's going to lead to the collapse of the global order, and the world on the other side of this conflict is going to be fundamentally different from the world that all of us have lived in since at least the fall of the Soviet Union. We'll do this as a series of dominoes, all right? So the first domino, the one that's falling right now, is your fuel supply crunch. Global oil crunch means less fuel, and that leads us to our second domino. What do you need fuel for? You need fuel to transport goods, okay? Especially in the US, we are very reliant on trucking to transport products across the country, okay? Our rail network has seen better days. Our port network is pretty good, but only useful in certain parts of the country. So really what we use is our trucking, and an increase in the price of diesel fuel means an increase in transportation costs for literally everything, every single product. You're gonna see inflation. You're gonna wish for the 8% inflation we had during COVID or whatever. That's gonna seem like a dream come true pretty soon here. So what this means is that these trucking companies will stop delivering goods to certain communities, specifically rural communities. We're looking at local goods shortages in rural communities because it's more economical for trucks to only deliver goods to cities, because more people live in cities. You can transport more goods there and have a guaranteed market. Whereas if you go, out into the sticks, people aren't as willing to buy in bulk. The economics just make less sense. And if there are fewer shortages and if the price of gasoline is way up, you would rather do the wholesale than try and schlep all the way out to the sticks. So if you live in a rural area, expect come, maybe, I don't know, September, October, for your local grocery store to start having some empty shelves. All of this uncertainty and turmoil will lead to the fourth domino, that is a market crash. I think a market crash is basically inevitable anyway, even if this Iran war didn't happen, because the Iran war, or the stock market has been insanely overvalued because of the AI bubble. Even though the entire rest of the economy is in a recession, the AI bubble has been single-handedly growing the tech sector and propping up the entire stock market. And as soon as that pops, the whole thing was going to go anyway. And now basically we just accelerated that timeline. And then the fifth domino, the weakening of the U.S. economy, the weakening of our geopolitical position from this Iran war, is going to allow China to invade Taiwan, which may or may not start World War III. Bonus domino is the hantavirus that I'm sure you've seen in news headlines these past 2 weeks or so. I'm not super concerned about this virus. Yes, it is very deadly, but it's not nearly as contagious as COVID. And a virus being deadly actually prevents it from spreading, because if you're not alive, you can't spread a virus, right? So I'm not panicking. I'm not ringing the alarm bells on this particular issue right now. Just thought I'd mention it because if I didn't, I'm sure I would get a comment about it. Alright, so that concludes the video. If you want my advice, panic the fuck out, freak the fuck out, sell everything. Definitely buy some jerry cans and fill it up with gas. Oh, I should say there is a piece of good news. If you live in the US, chances are your electricity won't be affected by this. Our electricity is primarily based from natural gas, so a total collapse of the grid probably isn't on the horizon, unless the transportation network is so severely affected that the natural gas physically can't make it to the power plants. Okay, with that said, buy rice and beans, learn how to cook for yourselves. Things are going to get nasty. I really wish I had some good news, but I just don't see this problem being solved. I don't see an exit ramp. I don't see a way that Trump can resolve all of this and reopen the Strait of Hormuz in any sort of timely fashion. And again, even if he does do that tomorrow, the economic consequences are still going to be pretty dire. Alright, I'll catch y'all next time. I'm still working on my MAGA autopsy video. Hopefully it'll be out, I don't know, next month. Yeah, catch y'all on the flip side. I'm depressed and I'm going to go get drunk.